Okay, and we're up and running. So, like always, pop your questions in. Leanne, if you did you say that you had a big group with you? So, if you can just kind of filter any questions or comments, that would be great. Otherwise, let's get cracking. So, today's webinar, we're going to be looking at IMHA support and who gets one, and also the role. Oh, I can see that there's 7 of you there sitting in the room. That's great. Yes, that doesn't make me feel better. I don't know. Yes, it's nice to be connected with everybody. Okay, right, you throw me there. And we've got another lady joining us. I'll just wait. Oh no, I'm going to carry on because we'll be waiting. Okay, so background to IMHA. I wanted to acknowledge this. IMHA has a long tradition, and that the introduction of the 2007 Act, where statutory advocacy was defined, that came on the back of mental health advocacy being around for many, many years and having a really rich tradition of peer advocacy and community-based advocacy in mental health settings. So that's in hospitals, but also for people outside of hospitals in the community, where people, especially peer advocacy, people will get together to raise awareness, campaign, make changes to the system. And independent mental health advocacy very much sits on the shoulders there, and it continues to do that. IMCA, when independent mental capacity advocacy was introduced, that was like a brand new, very specific model. But IMHA, I think it's important that we realise and appreciate that actually there was nothing new around IMHA. The only thing that changed was that it became a statutory right for certain people. And that's what we're going to look at today. Emily, welcome. Can I ask, I think, are you based in Wales? Can you just pop in? Because the provisions for IMHA are slightly different in Wales. So if you're from Wales, I'll just make sure I cover both. Yes, I thought so. Brilliant, lovely. Okay, so we've got slides on both, so that this will work okay. Okay, so what's the role of the IMHA? Well, it's no different, as we keep saying on these webinars. Advocacy is advocacy. So IMHA, IMCA, children's complaints advocacy, it's always about helping that person to speak up and be involved. It's always about protection of rights, and it's always about representation if they want you to. But with IMHA, of course, we've got it in a very, very specific setting of mental health. So the Code of Practice talks about IMHAs specifically helping people to understand the legal provisions to which they're subject to. And what that basically means is how and why are they detained under the Mental Health Act. So what section and what for how long, and what does that permit the hospital to do. I'm going to just draw your attention to the phrase qualifying patients. So this is the official term in the Mental Health Act and the Code of Practice that describes people who are eligible for the IMHA service. Some people don't like qualifying patients. I myself just prefer to use the word person, but it's really up to you. But for the webinar today, I will probably use the word qualifying patients just to describe a person who's entitled to IMHA. But usually we just say person or people. The Code of Practice also talks around IMHAs, helping that person to understand the rights and what safeguards have been introduced through the Mental Health Act. And we'll come to them a little bit later. And then, of course, the Code of Practice talks around IMHAs. It's not just helping somebody understand, but actually exercise those rights and enjoy those rights. So it's not enough to just know that they exist. An advocate, of course, helps the person to enjoy them, exercise their rights. That's what we say. Okay. I want to reference the right to be heard research. And forgive me if I just disappear for a second. I'm going to put a link here. So in 2010, 2012, the University of Central Lancashire undertook some research looking at the quality of IMHA. And to my knowledge, it's the only national research that has ever been published around mental health advocacy. This is the link I've just popped up to the website where you can get the research. But it was really significant. It took a couple of years to complete. But what they looked at was availability of IMHA and the quality. So what did people experience? How did they experience it? And they found some really positive things that we can take comfort in and encouragement from. And some things that we need to get better at. But this slide is really to just capture what people said made a quality IMHA service. And the first thing is about accessibility. So one which is easily available. One where the person has trust and feels that you're on their side and independent from the hospital. I think it's a huge issue when you are so heavily based in hospitals. So you might have an office in the ward. How you maintain that independence, but it's critical that the person has confidence and trust in you. People talked at length around how IMHAs and advocates need to enable a person to express their own views, so this idea of self-advocacy. And then also about influence and decisions. And there's a school of thought that we need to be aware of as IMHAs, that if we're not changing things and helping that person to take power, then what we're doing is we're kind of rubber stamping things, and we can give the illusion of protecting somebody's rights by being part of that system. But unless we actually influence decisions and get things changed, then there's a question there to be asked about, are we just putting a sweetener on a system that people feels is oppressive and restrictive? Because as you know, if you've worked in a mental health setting, the number one issue that people want from an IMHA is to get out. People generally say, I don't want to be here, detained against my will, I want to get out. And as IMHAs, yes, our job is to help the person with processing information, but fundamentally it's to help them get out. And nowhere is that more acutely felt than at the moment, where in settings where people have been there for a long time and will come under the ban of transforming care. Leanne and the team, I think, do you work in hospitals where patients come under transforming care? So this is the government programme that was introduced following Winterbourne, where the goal is to get people with autism and learning disabilities out of long-stay hospitals into the community. And as advocates, I see nationally that we really need to up our game and our effectiveness in making that happen, because too many people, I think on average, people with autism and learning disabilities are on average staying there for 5 years, which is bizarre, because the Code of Practice, the Mental Health Act, everybody agrees that mental health hospitals are not the right place for people with autism and learning disabilities, unless it's a very short-term kind of crisis intervention. But people aren't staying there short-term. They're staying there for 5 years, on average. Leanne, you've said they call them LAEP. What does that stand for? Oh, we like a good acronym. I like making things up. Yes, Emily, what does it stand for? Tell us. I'm tempted. Local authority, local area emergency protocol. Wow. Okay. Okay, I've not heard of that one. Right, let's crack on. So staying with the research, some of the things that they found were problematic were these areas. So the first one was, Leanne's put a bit more. They do it as well to try and keep people with autism and LD out of hospital. Oh, brilliant, lovely. Yeah, so kind of preventing community placements, breaking down, lovely. Yeah, that's great. Okay, back to the slide. So some of the areas that IMHAs need to think about, and certainly Emily, from a complaints advocate, this is relevant for your work. So accessibility, the research found that about 50% of qualifying patients actually had an advocate. Now, we wouldn't expect it to be 100% because not everybody wants an advocate. Some people can self-advocate or have natural advocates that they call on, but 50% felt very low. And the gaps that the research uncovered were related to equalities, which was really worrying. And they found that if you're from a seldom heard group, like somebody from a BME community, or if you were deaf, or if you had a dual diagnosis of learning disability and mental health, or if you couldn't instruct an advocate, you were less likely to get one. And that's what gave rise to the opt-out policy. Now, Leanne, I think you guys have an opt-out policy. Emily, so that you know what an opt-out policy is, this is what we call an automatic referral to advocacy. So if somebody from a qualifying patient, as soon as they are eligible for IMHA, they automatically get referred to the IMHA service unless they opt out. And in most areas, that's seen eligibility and accessibility jump to 90% plus. Leanne, do you know what your figures are since opt-out? I was with Diana yesterday at Empowerment Matters, and I think theirs is 92 or 98%. It's, you know, really high. It's fantastic. Of people who are eligible actually using advocacy. Not sure if you know what your data are. So Emily, does the opt-out system apply everywhere? Brilliant question. No, so this is best practice. It's not a legal requirement. The legal requirement at the moment is that advocacy is offered to qualifying patients, and the Mental Health Act and the Code of Practice in England and Wales puts the responsibility on the hospital manager to offer advocacy, not refer. The Mental Health Act is currently being reviewed, which I'm sure you're all up to speed with. They published their report, I think, was it just before Christmas or just after Christmas? It was very recent. And one of the things that the report recommends is that IMHA is an opt-out service. So that's very encouraging and very positive to ensure that people get advocacy. Okay. The quick acknowledgement of some of the other issues that the research uncovered. One was recording activity was not where it should be. This was a few years ago, so I think as a whole the sector's improved this with better data recording and better analysis of data. But one of the issues was around equalities data and trying to find out how well used the advocacy service was from people from seldom hate groups, so that we can. And that starts, of course, with monitoring and recording that activity. And then the other killer, which continues, is professionals' understanding of IMHA and advocacy in general, isn't it? That seems to be an ongoing issue. But the research, the Right to Be Heard research, really tapped into this idea that the success of the advocacy work is in part reliant on the support given by the professionals who are gatekeepers, in effect, to advocacy. So if you've got a really entrenched relationship with the hospital, that's going to be problematic in getting people an advocate. As is having too close a relationship, because the person using advocacy probably won't trust you if you're too close to the hospital. So it's getting that sweet spot in the middle. Okay, qualifying patients. So a slide on England and then a slide on Wales. So dead simple, you are eligible for support from an IMHA if you're detained under the Act, and that's any section of the Act, so Section 2, Section 3, the forensic sections like 37, 41. Emily, if they're sections that if you've been convicted of a criminal offence and then you have to be detained for mental health treatment, you get transferred from prison into hospital. The only ones that are excluded from that are the emergency sections. So this is in England. If you're held on the emergency section of Section 4 or 5, which are the very short-term 72 hours where the doctor or nurse can hold the person until the proper assessments can be completed, then they're not entitled to an IMHA. And the thinking at the time was because they didn't want IMHA to become like an emergency service. So if somebody was being held, at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, that you had to have an IMHA there. And the other kind of valid objection to having IMHA is there for Section 4 and 5 were real concerns that people felt the person being detained would associate that section and process with the advocate and would essentially say, you were there, why didn't you stop that from happening? So that was the thinking at the time about why. I'll come on to that in a second when we look at Wales, but just so you know, that's kind of the background. But most people who access IMHA will be on Section 2 or 3 or 3741. This phrase, liable to be detained under the Act, does not refer to informal patients. Liable to be detained is a legal phrase which refers to patients that are absent without leave or patients on leave, and those people are eligible to have an IMHA. And then the other three are conditionally discharged, patients who are on guardianship, which we know is being used less and less, but also patients on community treatment orders, so they might be referred to as CTO or SCT patients, and they will be in the community. So as an IMHA, you all should be heavily based in the hospital for the patients detained on the section, but then you also need to have a presence in the community for patients on the community treatment orders. Okay, so that's in England. It also covers young people. They're a little bit extra for young people who are informal if they're under 18 and being considered for ECT. Now, it's unusual for a young person to have ECT or be considered for ECT and be informal. I'm not aware of that happening, but those young people are entitled to an IMHA, so you need to know that. And then the other group of patients would be people for which Section 57 applies. And again, this is very invasive procedures, things like hormone replacement therapies or treatment for sexual mental health problems to do with sexual deviancy, I think. And yeah, so quite extreme, but my experience, is that most people who have them are already detained, so they wouldn't be informal, but it's there, so you need to know. So that's in England. So any questions, chuck them in. Otherwise, I will move on to Wales. Now in Wales, it's all dead easy. In Wales, basically, it's anyone who is receiving any care in a psychiatric hospital, and that includes informal patients, patients held on the emergency sections, and patients who are detained formally under the Act. So in Wales, what they did is so in 2009, when the IMHA role was available, England and Wales were the same, and it was just for people detained. And then the Welsh government introduced a measure, mental health measure, which extended entitlement to advocacy, and that's proved really, really successful. Not only because it's much more simpler. If you think in England, and I'm sure Leanne and team, you'll find this, that on the wards it can be difficult if you have an informal patient approach you, because you're not meant, technically they're not eligible for your service. But of course, you're not going to ignore them. And if you've got somebody perhaps who's saying, I want to get off the ward, they're not letting me. And, as an advocate, I think any advocate would then spend some time saying to that person, no, you are allowed to leave the ward. And if the staff don't, then that's either unlawful or they need to hold you on emergency, or they need to detain you. They need to have a legal framework for that. You wouldn't just ignore them, would you? But as an IMHA in England, you're not meant to really do that. They're not eligible for your service. But in Wales, it's much easier. IMHAs are working with anyone and everyone who are receiving support in psychiatric hospitals, and those people who are in the community on guardianship, community treatment orders, or conditional discharge. Conditional discharge. Okay, any questions from anybody about who is eligible? So it's not age specific. It is, the Mental Health Act doesn't talk about children, adults in that way. Very children have extra rights, but it's for anyone in Wales detained. Anybody receiving support in a psychiatric hospital, and in England, it's anybody detained, subject to compulsion would be the phrase that we use. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions come through, so let's have a little look at your rights as an IMHA. So these mirror similar things to IMCA and Care Act advocates. So the first thing is that as an IMHA, you should have access to the wards where the units where people are resident. Now, the only exclusion to that would be about risk. Now, if you go to see somebody and the hospital block you and say it's not safe or the person's unsettled, you have to take that seriously and abide by that. But if it's happening a lot and it's happening every time you go, or 50% of the time you go, I think I'd be raising questions around that. Similarly, if a patient's in seclusion, they should still be able to meet with you, but it might be that a member of staff has to be close by, and you would just have to work that out as you go. But you have to be led by the professionals and their risk assessments in that scenario. As an IMHA, you have a right to meet with the person in private, wherever that's safe to do so. You don't have to meet with the person in private, but be led by them. Some people are very happy sitting in a communal lounge or having a chat in the corridor. That's fine. There's nothing to say that you can't meet with them there. What's important is that they're leading that process. And of course, what it's saying is that the hospital is on a duty to provide you with a private space. So if there isn't, then I think you need to be talking to the hospital about making sure that there is a private space to meet with your partners. You also have the right to attend meetings between the patients and the professionals, and to be involved in care and treatment decisions. And again, that's always led by the patient. So I wouldn't attend a meeting without the person's instruction. If it's non-instructed advocacy, so I'm not able to take instruction, I would be making judgments on which meetings to go to and how is the best way for me to represent this person. Okay, there is also a right to access records, but that would be again led by the person. So if the person has capacity, they would need to consent to you having access. If they lack capacity, it would be up to the hospital to decide which records were relevant, but certainly anything to do with the mental health and care planning, CPAs, CCR meetings, those types of things you would be expecting to have access to as an IMHA. Oh, that's there on the records. Speak to any person who is professionally concerned with the person. This is really important because we find that consultants and clinicians tend to ignore advocates. Please tell me that's not just me, but you know, they technically, according to the Code of Practice, you have a legal right to interview, is the phrase. You have a legal right to interview the person, the clinician, the AMP, the responsible clinician as well. So if you're having problems with that, you can use the Code of Practice to feed that back to the hospital and say, look, this is problematic. I really need to get information, etc. Okay, let's move on to the role. So before we do that, any questions at all about eligibility, or is that making sense? Is it just confirmed what you already know? Any questions, pop in. Just want to have a little sip of water. Okay, go for it, Emily. If you've got a mic, Emily, you can feel free to use that if you don't want to type it in. So the Code of Practice applies in England and the mental health measure in Wales. Okay, so we've got what we call primary and secondary legislation. The primary legislation is the Mental Health Act. And you know it's primary legislation because it'll always have an act at the end of it. Okay, the Mental Health Act applies in England and Wales. England and Wales have separate Code of Practices. So the Code of Practice is what we call secondary legislation. And so the primary legislation basically says what has to happen. The Code of Practice basically tells us how to do that. So in Wales and England, there are different Code of Practices. And I'm going to put in the two links. Okay. They have been reviewed recently. I think the Welsh one was reviewed in 2016, I think. I'm not sure about that. And the English one was reviewed in 2013. So So this is the Welsh one, and you can get it there. The mental health measure was an extra kind of introduction at the Welsh Government. So that was the Welsh Government's way of amending the legislation, if that makes sense. So rather than go back and, reinvent the whole Mental Health Act, they just added a measure to extend the Mental Health Act in Wales to more people. Does that make sense? But the code of practices are different. Hi Leanne, hi Maureen. Don't worry, we were just talking about the Welsh code of practice, so you haven't missed anything. And the link is there for the Welsh code of practice. Leanne and gang, that's like a mouthful, isn't it? Leanne and gang. Anyway, the English code of practice was revised in 2013, so make sure you've got the up-to-date one. There were some changes around the principles, so I'm going to put the English link in as well, because there were some changes on the principles and also around young people, and a lovely chapter that helps us work out interplay between Mental Capacity Act and Mental Health Act. So the first one's the Welsh one, the second one's the English one. Right, we're going to look at the IMHA role. So this is what the Code of Practice in England says. Emily, the Welsh Code of Practice is pretty similar. It says the same thing. Excuse me, it's about helping that person with information on their rights, their safeguards, taking instructions, but it's all to do with the mental health treatment. The reason for that is it's meant to be boundaries. It's not, IMHAs are not meant primarily to be helping with issues like benefits or housing or form filling, that type of thing. Now, there is a lovely phrase in both the Code of Practice and in the English and the Welsh, which says an IMHA can support a person on any other issues connected with care and treatment. Now, a good example of this would be an issue around a pet, let's say. So let's say somebody's best friend is their dog and they are in hospital and they are worried and stressed that the dog isn't being looked after. They're also worried and stressed that they're not seeing the dog, and actually the dog gives them comfort and kind of some relief from mental health distress. And this relationship with the dog is the most important relationship. Now, as an IMHA, and they come to you and they say, can you check on my dog? Now, as an IMHA, you wouldn't normally see that as part of the advocate's job. But I think you can legitimately spend a bit of time on that, even if it's just a few phone calls to social worker or community person to check on the dog, or even ask for like leave, so the person can see the dog, or would the hospital allow the dog to come onto the ground so they can walk around the grounds with the dog, whatever that might be. And you could, I think, argue that on grounds that in order to engage with the care and treatment planning, they need to fix this problem. And that could be about benefits. Like you could, I think, legitimately argue that this person's so stressed and consumed with benefits or money worries or financial planning that they can't engage with the care and treatment until that's resolved. So as an advocate, you're going to spend some time doing that. Now, I'm just saying, I don't want you to think I'm saying that's what you should all rush out and do, look for these issues that are outside him and justify them. No, because we appreciate that you're probably overstretched, you're probably at capacity, and the idea of then helping people on these kind of peripheral issues you might be thinking, oh, I haven't got time to do that. That's okay. It's up to you to prioritise where you spend your time. What I'm saying is I think you can legitimately justify spending time on that. Emily, you've said, I had a case surprisingly similar to that, where a patient was distressed about admission to hospital and refused treatment because he was concerned about who would look after the dogs. Yeah. And we know how important and significant relationships are with animals and pets. So yeah, it's, we need to, as a person-centered, person-led service, we need to be appreciative of that and support people wherever we can. Yeah. Okay, so that's what the Code of Practice says. But we like simples, don't we? We like nice, simple. And this is the standard slide I'm using in every single webinar to hammer home the simplicity of advocacy, no matter what we're doing, whether it's IMHA, Care Act, complaints, children's, it's these three circles. So the first thing we're doing as an IMHA is supporting that person to self-advocate. If the person doesn't want to self-advocate or can't self-advocate, we're going to represent them. And then alongside that, we're checking that the decision-making processes are in line with the legislative frameworks. And if they're not, we're going to challenge those decisions or decision-making processes. So to just give you a few examples of where this fits in, a slide on each of them. So self-advocacy, think around as an IMHA how you help a person access information. And try where you can to avoid becoming the deliverer of news. And Emily, I think this is relevant for you as a complaints advocate, that sometimes professionals can rely on the advocates to deliver bad news. For instance, I was just thinking of a recent example. I was in a mental health ward the other day, and the patient said to the IMHA, can I have leave? And the advocate, who's a great advocate, immediately said, okay, let me go find that out for you. Off he went, spoke to the nurses in the office. Off he came back to the patient and explained that leave hadn't been approved, and the doctor was now off-site and couldn't authorise it. And we reflected afterwards around, was that part of the advocacy role to go and get that information? And technically it is. Technically, I don't think it's bad advocacy, but I think better advocacy is to say to that person, okay, so you've got a question about leave, great, let's go and ask that together. Or do you think you can ask that question and I'll come with you? And that way we are promoting nurturing self-advocacy in a very, very subtle, informal way. We're just introducing it as part of our practice. And the benefit of that, of course, it's going to help the person to get used to asking questions themselves. But what we're doing is we're also getting the person and the staff talking to one another about more things. And that's what we want. We want the patient ultimately to be able to go themselves without the need for an advocate. Now, not everybody can do that. So, of course, if the person says, oh, I don't want to, will you go? Of course, I wouldn't hesitate to go and ask. But my starting point is self-advocacy. And I think that's a really good example in a mental health setting, where sometimes the advocates can become a bit fixy, by which I mean we fix problems, we go and solve them, instead of just taking a step back and promoting the self-advocacy. Does that make sense? Emily said, this is an issue I come across far too often. I feel I'm constantly explaining to professionals, you're the complainant advocate, not the yeah. So is this where the professionals are asking you to almost advocate for them, whether that's through explaining information and putting forward rationale, perhaps even. So yeah, so it's never say never. It might be appropriate for you to do that, but my starting point is always self-advocacy. Can they do that? And then the other points here are around, you can help that person prepare for meetings, things like role play, things like writing down their questions. That's all that rich self-advocacy, isn't it? Great. Okay. Let's have a little look at representation. So wherever the person doesn't want to self-advocate or can't self-advocate because they lack capacity, then you're going to be representing. So this is where you are legally entitled to attend meetings and you are put forward. So in instructed advocacy, and I've just differentiated between the two approaches. In instructed advocacy, you will be being person-led. You'll be putting forward their requests, their preferences, no matter what they are, getting that information to feed it back, and influencing things like discharge planning. In non-instructed advocacy, you need to make decisions about how is the best way to represent my partner's interests and their goals, if I'm able to find out what some of those goals are. Now, you can, as in the person's representative, request for a tribunal, for instance. Now, I don't think you would routinely ask for tribunals for everybody who lacks capacity. But as a non-instructed advocate, I would be looking at that, and I would look at when was the last time they had a tribunal. And has anything changed significantly since that? Has medication improved somewhat? Have things deteriorated? Are they showing signs that they're objecting to being in hospital? All those things might lead me to ask for a tribunal. And of course, if they lack capacity, I'd be having an eye on the discharge planning. And ironically, the code of practice, do you know when it says discharge planning should begin? Anybody know what the code of practice says? When should discharge planning begin? I'll give you a minute to answer that. On admission, spot on. So yeah, it says discharge planning should begin as soon as the person is admitted. We know it doesn't. And I have got a vision right now, Leanne, of your team laughing and falling off your chairs, going, ha ha ha, that never happens. And I know it doesn't happen. But in non-instructed advocacy, of course, we can be pushing for that and asking questions around what is the discharge plan. Does that make sense? Hopefully so. Then the third area is about this check and challenge. So we also call that the audit function. So this is where we're checking that the Mental Health Act is being correctly applied. So things like second opinion or CPA meetings, are they happening? If they are under the Transforming Care programme, NHS England, are they holding CTRs, the Community Treatment Reviews? Is the patient having access to leave? If they lack capacity, and my experience of working in mental health hospitals is a very poor understanding of the Mental Capacity Act. But if the patient lacks capacity, are decisions being made in line with the Mental Capacity Act? And they're the things that we're challenging, checking and challenging, sorry. Does that all make sense? Okay, any questions? Because we are getting near the end now. So I've got some little case studies. So I want you to tell me whether, so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some kind of really short case studies, and I want you to tell me whether this person would have an IMHA offered. Are they entitled? Is this person a qualifying patient? So if you think they are, hit yes. If you think no, hit no. I think we're on Maureen's computer. Maureen, Leanne, if you want to just, if everyone agrees, chuck in an answer. If not, put in the text box the split. Okay, so everybody said yes. Okay, so she was admitted on Section 2 for assessment. She doesn't understand why she can't leave. So yes, this would be a typical request for advocacy, and yes, she is entitled to IMHA support because she's detained under Section 2. Sometimes there can be issues in getting to see Section 2 patients quickly, and there are tight rules on when you can apply for a tribunal. So if you're detained under Section 2 and want to appeal that decision, you only have 14 days to do that. And you can see how that can go quite quickly if the advocate isn't informed that Sarah was admitted. So you may, I don't know what, I mean, if you've got an opt-out policy, you'd expect to be seeing Sarah within a couple of days. But if you haven't, this is where there can be like a bottleneck in accessing rights, because if the Section 2 patient doesn't get to see them until day 13, 14, they might lose their right, their entitlement to appeal. Okay, let's do the next one. So Tom, he came in, he admitted himself informally. So would he be entitled to an IMHA? Okay, so yeah, you're spot on. And well done, Emily, for getting in Wales. So in Wales, Tom would be entitled because he is in a hospital. He's in a psychiatric hospital, and it doesn't matter what section he's on. It doesn't matter if he's informal or formal. So in Wales, the answer is yes. But in England, the answer is no, because he's an informal patient and now he's on an emergency section. If he is then held on a Section 2 or Section 3, then he'll be entitled in England. So well done. Okay, let's have a look at Hope. Would Hope have an independent mental health advocate? Okay. So, similar to Tom, in Wales, that's straightforward. She's in hospital, so she would be entitled to him. In England, she isn't, because she's an informal patient. However, she is alleging that she was hit by another patient. So, if we think about safeguarding, if you were the IMHA talking to Hope, then you could, you'd be talking to Hope about possibly raising a safeguarding alert. And if a safeguarding inquiry is called, for a bonus point of 10 points, what type of advocacy would Hope be entitled to if she faces substantial difficulty and doesn't have anyone to support her? So pop in the text box, bonus 10 points, and the respect of your colleagues. What advocacy would you get? Spot on, Maureen. So she will be entitled to a Care Act advocate. And obviously, because the IMHA already knows it, you would argue that the IMHA will probably take that on. So even though the IMHA would be supporting Hope, not as an IMHA, but as a Care Act advocate, and Hope probably wouldn't notice any difference. But I'd be thinking as an advocate, yes, as an advocate, if she faces substantial difficulty, of course, that I can support her. That there's a route there for me to get in and support Hope. Does that make sense? Not too controversial, I hope. Okay, two more. So Khalil is 15. He's detained under Section 3. So we've got a young person now. Would Khalil have support from an independent mental health advocate? He's a young person. Would he have an IMHA or something else? Okay. So we've got a yes and a no. So the answer is yes. He would absolutely have an IMHA. The Mental Health Act, remember, doesn't distinguish or differentiate in ages. It's the Mental Health Act applies to everybody. There's no minimum or maximum age. So the fact is 15 is a red herring. It doesn't matter. The important bit in England is that he's detained under Section 3. So Maureen, you said that the group was split, which is fine, which is great. That means that we're learning and we're getting to grips with this content. Please put down anything that's not clear, or if anybody kind of disagrees with that, get that down in the text box and we can talk about it. And likewise, if you've got a mic, pop it on and we can talk. But the answer to that is Khalil would have an IMHA, and IMHAs need to be working with young people who are subject to the compulsory powers of the Mental Health Act, and that's in England and Wales. Young people shouldn't be treated and detained on adult wards unless it's an absolute emergency. The revised Mental Health Act, when it came in 2007, made extra provision for young people, and that was one of the things it talked about, was young people should be treated and cared for in specialist units with specialist trained staff. And that's for IMHAs as well. IMHAs should be going into these units. Okay, let's go for the last one. So Janice is being treated under Section 3 for 18 months, so a long period of stay as an inpatient. She's getting ready to leave, and they are looking at discharge planning. So Emily, just so that you know, discharge planning, also known as aftercare, that's authorised under Section 117 of the Mental Health Act. All that, Maureen, straight in with the yes. Boom. Yes, so you're both correct. Yeah, so because she's under Section 3. Now, this is where you've got a little bit of an overlap between IMHA and Care Act. While somebody's in hospital, clearly she's entitled to IMHA. And there's no other kind of criteria. The only criteria is that she's detained. Once she's discharged from that section or comes off the section and she's having care and support arranged for the community, she may be entitled to Care Act support. The criteria, of course, being that she faces substantial difficulty, she doesn't have anyone to support her. So what you've got is this kind of flow. So if you think about people who hit that criteria, so somebody who lacks capacity, say, the discharge planning should have an IMHA whilst they're in hospital and a Care Act advocate to then pick it up outside of hospital once they're discharged. But of course, it makes sense for the Care Act advocate to start that process whilst the discharge planning begins in hospital. So technically, you can have a Care Act advocate working with Janice while she's still detained, or you can have an IMHA support Janice as the Care Act advocate after she's released, discharged. Does that make sense? That was just the kind of the add-on there. There's a little crossover between Care Act and IMHA, and that's true in Wales and England. Same provisions. Okay, we are at the end of our webinar. So thank you for the questions and comments. We've got a nice chunk of time. If you've got any other questions or comments, I'll give you some time to pop them in and we can go through them. So any questions about eligibility, any questions about role, about who gets one, what you'll be doing as an IMHA. We have got another webinar that looks a bit more in details about IMHA issues, where we'll kind of be digging a bit deeper into what an IMHA does. This is an overview. But Maureen, the team haven't got any questions at the moment. Okay, excellent. Emily, have you any questions? I can't remember what you said about whether there are specific issues that an IMHA can support with. So as long as it's to do with the mental health care and treatment or detention under the mental health, then that's all fine. Is it just for assessment or care planning? So it's anything to do with the mental health. So the rights under the Mental Health Act, the care planning under the Mental Health Act, the treatment under the Mental Health Act, discharge from the Mental Health Act, leave, second opinions, anything like that. And the conversation we had before around the pets was that if there are other peripheral issues that prevent somebody engaging with those things, then I think you can legitimately support as an IMHA. Does that make sense? Of course, one of the things, no, it's fine, absolutely no problem. One of the things that you've, is it overlap between a complaints advocate, I don't know, Maureen, Leanne and team, whether you find this, is if somebody wants to make a complaint about the care and treatment that the NHS are providing. So let's say they're unhappy with food in the hospital, or they're unhappy with the clinician, you know, they just don't get on with the responsible clinician, and they want to complain about that. How do you guys treat that as an NHS complaints issue and refer to the NHS complaints, or in Wales, the CHC complaints advocacy service? Or are you picking that up as an IMHA? And I'm finding across the country, it's very hit and miss. Some IMHA services pick that up and run with it. And then some IMHA services are referring to the complaints advocacy service. So the patient's getting effectively two advocates, depending on the local arrangements. Do you have any experience or thoughts on that? The Maureen said, bit of both. If we are supporting them as an IMHA, you can deal with it. They would raise it that way. But then you also referring to the complaints advocacy service. I mean, it's something significant you'd open a separate one. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and it's quite grey in terms of what you should do. If you've got the contract for both, you know, dead easy, because it's the same service, it's the same advocate. But Emily, if you think about the IMHA service in your area, you know, it'd be interesting to have a conversation with them about who's picking up the complaints in NHS mental health hospitals. Should it be you or should it be the IMHA service? And it can be either. The common sense view, which I like, is that it's whoever's working with that person. You know, if you've got a good relationship, and stick with them. Emily says, after listening to this, I might consider more of the issues that come to us that could be referred to in there. But I think we do find more and more complaints come our way, probably because of the lack of capacity of the IMHA service. Yeah, that's. I don't think it's cynical. I think it's realistic that because of capacity, and that might be an appropriate way to tackle it. You know, that if maybe the IMHA's resources are better spent on the mental health care and treatment issues, and you know, is the NHS complaint system. Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think the more we can talk about it, the more robust the answer will be, isn't it? But it's great. Okay, then I think, shall I let you all, you lovely people, go on with your days? And thank you so much for joining in, as always. And I might see you next time. All right then, take care. Bye.